Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to be talking about Scorn again. If you went to any comment section about this game prior to its release, you would have heard one of two names, if not both, thrown around quite liberally by people who want to look like they're very knowledgeable of art history. The first was H.R. Giger, the guy who made the alien in Alien, as well as all other alien things of alien nature in Alien. But not aliens, though a little bit in Alien 3 and nothing really in Alien Resurrection or the really shitty Alien prequels. He's most well known for biomechanics, an art style that presents a dark, twisted dance of flesh and machine intertwined. The distinction in his work is often blurred, with the mechanical elements looking like spines, ridges, rib cages, and even outright organs, sprawling across vast, impossible landscapes. But, of course, he's still mostly known for his work in Alien, which has since gone down as one of the most iconic movies in all of cinema history, so it's not surprising that over the years where people are digging more and more into the history of that film, that Giger's name becomes a bigger and bigger thing. For those who wanted to seem even more like aficionados of the history of horror surrealism, there was Beksiński, Giger's Polish contemporary who also created vast worlds of strange imagery. While his works could not be considered biomechanical, he still had a very similar motif to Giger in the sense that animal and architecture seemed to be almost one and the same. The way this was most conveyed was in how architecture decayed, breaking down in exactly the same mesh-like structure that the creatures that dwelled around it did. Indeed, at times when looking at some of his paintings, it can be difficult to tell what's supposed to be a building, a statue, or something that formerly was, or heaven forbid still is, alive. And while it may be a cliche at this point to say that Scorn was inspired by those two individuals and their works, they aren't wrong to say that. Scorn absolutely is inspired by them, and it was even mentioned as much in the art book. But of course we eventually got out of the era of comments leading up to the game's release to comments after the game's release. Scorn had basically an across-the-board reception when it came out. Some people absolutely hated it, some people enjoyed it, and some people really loved it. As of now, it has a mostly positive overall rating on Steam and sits comfortably in the 70s on Metacritic for both users and critics. And hell, a lot of those negative reviews could be shitters who have just learned that there is a middle ground between Poppy Playtime and Doom. But over the course of the game's development, there have been people who express contempt over Scorn so deliberately and clearly lifting styles and elements from those two artists, regardless of what the game added to those styles to make it its own. Some have even claimed that the Giger and Beksinski estates should sue Ebb Software for copyright infringement, not aware that you can't sue someone for lifting a style, hence why Disney is not able to sue, say, the creators of Bendy and the Ink Machine for the rubber hose cartoon style that game tends to invoke. And while I have no idea what the Giger or Beksinski estate thinks about Scorn, if they view it favorably or not, I also don't know what Giger or Beksinski would have thought about Scorn, as both men died before Scorn's worldwide announcement back in 2014. However, I believe it is possible to make an educated guess on what they might have thought about the game. I will try to take into account what their overall opinions on video games are, their thoughts and views on newer mediums of art, and what their views are on people using their styles in general, since after all, Scorn certainly wasn't the first, nor will it be the last. Starting with H.R. Giger, he was alive long enough to see the video game industry grow and evolve over the years. He died early 2014, which means he would have been alive around the time to at least know about Dark Souls 2, Bayonetta 2, Far Cry 4, and Alien Isolation. But just because he could know about these things doesn't mean he did, and Giger just doesn't strike me as much of a gamer. Granted, an old guy who was born at like 1945 certainly isn't going to strike anyone as a gamer, but I don't think even if he was alive when Scorn had all the trailers and its ultimate release that he would be all too interested in playing it. That isn't to say that Giger knew absolutely nothing about video games. He could probably name you Mario, Sonic, Pikachu, or Kirby, and he's also dabbled in the medium himself by being a creative director to the Darkseid games. Giger is an artist, and I presume he does value his work to a degree, so him allowing a game company to use some of his art for their own projects must mean that he doesn't view video games as a totally irredeemable medium. In one interview, he was asked about his thoughts on digital art, in which he responded that it is basically just another medium of art people use to express their vision, not all that different than the traditional methods, and even goes on to cite how CGI allows for the creation and showcase of things that would have been impossible otherwise. So he certainly was not pretentious in these regards. Video games were just a medium of entertainment that weren't so lowbrow he could not possibly stand to have his name and reputation besmirched by association. And the tools needed to realize video games, that being art created on a computer, were of course art in of itself, just a brand new medium. But I think the thing that sheds most light on what his reaction might be was a different interview. In an issue of Bizarre magazine, one person asked what his thoughts were on the fact that the xenomorph has been incorporated into so many things that aren't movies. Things that might come across as lowbrow, like action figures and comic books, and yes, of course, video games. Giger's response was one I think many artists could relate to. When he started out in the wonderful world of the visual medium, he was relatively obscure and it was hard to get noticed. Now, here he is, one of the most influential surrealists of his century, and so many other endeavors are trying to incorporate his designs into their own work. He's made it, he's had an influence, and while poorly done recreations of his stuff are annoying, there's something immensely satisfying about it being done correctly. Love it or hate it, I think it's indisputable that Scorn has properly incorporated the biomechanical horrors that Giger first brought to life. The amount of intricacy and details it went out of its way to incorporate into its strange environment surpasses basically any game that has attempted to ape his style beforehand. Hell, it's even more impressive than the straight-up Alien games, which so often take place in worlds designed more by Ron Cobb than H.R. Giger. That, and I can't help but to think he might have given the game bonus points for the rather overt sexual elements and imagery presented within the final area. Biomechanics, dark transhumanism, flesh and technologies is important and all in the history of Giger's art, but you can't forget the penis. The guy drew Rule 34 of his own creation. Seriously, everyone else working on a Giger-related project, step the fuck up. So given the attention to detail and masterful recreation of biomechanics, as well as the rather overt sexual elements found within some parts of the game, I do think Giger would have overall approved of Scorn. Whether or not he would have enjoyed playing it is another thing, first and foremost not being much of a gamer himself, but also the fact that Giger actually wasn't all that into body horror, despite the fact that, stuff like the chestburster and whatnot are partially of his design. But that's only half of the equation. There's one more artist, of course, Beksiński, whose influence is also seen throughout Scorn. While the technology in Scorn is absolutely Giger, the environments and creatures are all heavily inspired by Beksiński. Just about anything organic in Scorn could be traced back to Beksiński. There's just a bit of a problem. By the time Giger died, he was sort of a household name. Many people could recognize the name, and if you said he's the guy who designed the creature from Alien, people would instantly understand his style. Unless they're one of the many shitters I've come across who has never seen Alien. To basically almost everyone I've met at the University of Arizona, get some fucking culture, you plebs. But by 2005, when Beksiński was unceremoniously murdered for what's effectively $100 at the time, he was not a household name. It's almost ironic that video games, the very subject we're talking about, are what actually pushed Beksiński to becoming a more well-known figure. There's works that outright lift his paintings like The Medium or the upcoming Nazralath, The Fallen World. Or there's video games that incorporate elements of his aesthetic, like Returnal and, of course, Scorn. Hell, I myself came to learn about this guy from reading people mentioning him in Scorn comment sections. So thanks, Peklar, you've introduced me inadvertently to a fantastic artist. Being the more obscure character at the time of his death, it's no surprise that there aren't many interviews to be found from him, let alone any interviews that touches upon the subject of video games. He died in the same year that heavy hitters like Resident Evil 4, Civilization 4, and Shadow of the Colossus came out, and yet I sincerely doubt he had much any interest or knowledge in any of them. And unlike Giger, he had absolutely no involvement in the video game industry to any extent while he was alive. Though we don't know what his opinions on video games specifically are, we do know what his attitude towards new mediums of art, the digital realm, were, because he actually engaged in it. In the 90s, Beksiński worked on various photo manipulation projects. While many consider this to be one of the weaker eras of his artistic career, there is a bit of a charm in the early work before much more advanced tools like Photoshop were widely available to the masses. But the key point is that he was willing to embrace a bold new area in the world of art, one he had not come across before, one he would have been so unfamiliar with he effectively would have had to learn to start from scratch. Beksiński was on record as saying he was largely uninfluenced by literature or cinema, two major storytelling mediums of his time, but that doesn't mean he didn't like them, and it's safe to say he was uninspired by the world of video games. But I think if he did have to develop a video game, if he was called upon to work on some brand new IP, he likely would have given it his all, being an exciting new area of art he has yet to dip his toes in. And similar to Giger, I think he would have appreciated the fact that some studio was so inspired by his works that they decided to incorporate it into his own project. He might even be more flattered than Giger because he was so much more obscure than the Swiss surrealist. Here was a studio putting a lot of time, energy, and effort into realizing some of his visions, the colors, the atmosphere, the aesthetics, the intricacies, and there, more and more people were being introduced to him by proxy, being able to look up his art and see all the strange macabre worlds he designed. And I don't think he would have taken such particular issue in his work being represented in a video game because by his own admission, he doesn't put much thought or feelings into the actual meaning behind his work. He just likes drawing cool vistas and pretty scenery. And so too did Ebb Software, though they seem to be wanting to put even more thought and meaning into what's being presented, and I'm sure he'd be fine leaving them to come up with their own interpretations of his work, just as many other people have in the past. So despite some of the assumptions I've seen, I don't think Giger or Beksinski would be unapproving of Scorn. I think they would be quite flattered and even interested in seeing the project go into completion. Their estates might grumble at the fact of the game's existence, but estates are composed of shitters who like to use the talent of other people and the copyright laws that exist around their works to bully complete strangers into giving them money or recognition despite putting in none of the actual work themselves. Just because you came from the actual author or artist's ballsack doesn't mean you're entitled to gatekeep his work. So yeah, that's basically it. I think they would have approved overall of Scorn and maybe even watched a let's play of it. Perhaps in a future video, I'll go over even more how Scorn was influenced by those two artists, including even more direct comparisons between what's shown off in the game and the individual works those two have done. But until that day comes, I hope you enjoyed the video, that I gave you something to think about, and otherwise entertained you. Take care.